because I'm interested in how stories work inside of us and between us and through us and to us. But also the activist part is about what stories do we choose to activate? And right now is a critical point in time in history where we're asking ourselves, okay, we've just been through something like, we're still in the midst of something huge. Who are we going to choose to be as a result of this, or even in the face of this?
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. So if I think back to my life 20 years ago, I knew exactly who I was. I knew what I stood for. I knew where I came from. I knew where I was going. And then I hit some road bumps along the way. And I ended up not being sure who I was or what the point was or what I'd accomplished or even what I was supposed to do next. Maybe what I needed was a new story. Our guest for today, storyteller Mary Alice Arthur, says that your story is your rudder. Her TEDx talk on storytelling challenges us to become story activists, using stories to call into being a new world. The stories we tell ourselves shape not only the way we understand the world, they shape what's possible for us. So the stories we tell about women shape who we allow ourselves to be. And the stories we tell about aging shape what we expect from our future. And if we don't like the story, it's up to us to rewrite it. And Mary Alice is going to show us how. Welcome, Mary Alice.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Okay, so before we get started, I want to share with our audience something that made me click with you instantly. So you and I have both spent a lot of our lives living and working overseas, and you've got a special name for this. You call this intentional nomading.
Yep.
So what is that?
I think of an intentional nomad as somebody who travels between people and place, witnessing them, calling possibility to life. So unlike digital nomads, who seem to be people who can kind of like work anywhere, like, hey guys, today I'm at the beach and I'm traveling because I want the view or I want the company or whatever. I think of intentional nomading as much more intentional, going, okay, I'm going to go here because my unique skills are called for, or I've been invited, and I may not know exactly why, but I know I feel the call, and that's where I'm going to go.
See, I love that. And we also both spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and that is where you fell in love with storytelling.
Yeah, that's right. There's some people who feel like they've grown up in storytelling. I've met a lot of people say, oh, my grandmother was just such a fantastic storyteller. My uncle, my dad, my whatever, it seems to be in the family. And I feel like I grew up in the house of secrets, not the house of stories. So my grandfather was in World War I. My dad was in World War II. These were guys who didn't speak a lot about their experiences. And I can imagine from what we now know, how traumatic those were, that probably I was living with somebody who suffered from PTSD, and only there was no name for it at that time. So you just kind of literally soldiered on. So I didn't hear a lot of stories as I was growing up. In fact, I remember the moment when he came to visit me in New Zealand, and we were with my boyfriend's family in Christchurch. And he told a story to my boyfriend, and my mouth dropped open because it wasn't something I'd ever heard. But obviously, place, proximity, I don't know, young guy, called this story up. And so I went to a storytelling festival. That's the first time I ever really saw story in action, and I was mesmerized.
And this is where, in some ways, the intentional nomading comes in, because you kept traveling and you kept collecting those stories.
Mm. If you can imagine hunter-gatherer types, the women with baskets on their back, I felt a lot like I was like that, kind of. I realized over time, metaphorically, that I was kind of picking up a story and putting it in my little basket and picking up another one. And I used to have a prayer, let me tell the story that needs to be told. And I thought that meant, when I first began realizing that was a possibility, that I would make up a story in the moment that would be perfect. And that's actually not what happened. I had to learn to trust myself that the stories I'd collected along the way would offer themselves at exactly the right time in the group I was in. And so I would take a story from Japan and tell it in Chicago. And I would take Chicago's story and take it to Stockholm. And that's how it seems to have been working in my life.
So So did you write these stories down or did you memorize them?
There are things that happened or things that people told me. One time I ran into a storyteller and I asked her, what kind of stories do you tell? And I thought she was going to tell me a genre or something, but she said, all of the stories that fit on my tongue. And I really did wow at the time, because I realized that's true for me too. If it's a story that's meant to be mine, I can remember it easily. If it's not, then I have to work on it, or it passes through and it doesn't land somehow. That's how I've realized what's mine to tell. And an example was, I've been a facilitator for 25 years. I've worked with a lot of groups of people. And I was working with a group of Afghani civil servants, and that's what I tell about in my TED Talk. And I was kind of struggling with how do I tell them about the power of story? Because you can tell somebody that as much as you want, but demonstrating it is so much more powerful. And suddenly a story popped to mind that I had read 10, maybe 15 years earlier. I didn't remember the name of the key character, but I remembered the shape of the story well enough so that when I told it, they said, that's a story from our land, isn't it? That's when a story has landed and it was the right one, because it does the magic. It bridges the gap in a way nothing else can.
So many of us were introduced to stories back in college when we studied Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces, and this idea that you could go out and you can collect myths and legends and you could compare them and find these wonderful parallels. But what is interesting about you is that what you're focused on is not the myths and legends of the culture as much as the stories of ordinary people living their ordinary lives. Why do you think those are important?
I sometimes talk about what I call the big S and the little s stories. Big S stories, I'm like, wow, that was so dramatic that it's riveting, right? I went to a storytelling festival or storytelling conference from the National Storytelling Network that was in Oklahoma City. And they had invited people to come, some of the storytellers from that town, to come and tell their stories of the bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing. And one of them, which I remember even today, the woman said, she started off her story like this: it was a beautiful day. She said, I've interviewed a lot of people who've been in disasters, and many of their stories start like that. It was a beautiful day. But then, and her story actually was, she had been in the meeting room in the government building. She had been she went to the whiteboard to write something on the whiteboard when the explosion happened. And when she turned around, there was a hole in the floor and she was the only person there. What a big S story. Story with a big S. But that makes, when you think of a big S story, and North America is a culture that is loving these big S stories and feeds on them. But that makes a lot of the rest of us feel like we don't have those stories. Like, hey, I'm not that interesting. Maybe I haven't got anything to say. But that's where I think the little S story comes in. There's gold in our lived experience. And we file our lived experience in our heads in the neural network in the form of stories, right? So your story about how you handled an upset teenager at the point where you thought you might go crazy and throw them out of the house, or your story about how you handled that moment in the office, which was really untenable, really, you could have had a classic meltdown, but you didn't. That story about how you looked yourself in the face in the mirror in the morning and you try to convince yourself you were enough. That story might be the remedy for somebody who's right on the edge of something. So that story could be the key that fits in the lock that opens the door for somebody else. That's why little S stories are really important. And knowing how to find and work with our own stories of lived experience is such a vital thing. That's why I call myself a story activist, because I'm interested in how stories work inside of us and between us and through us and to us. But also the activist part is about what stories do we choose to activate? And right now is a critical point in time in history where we're asking ourselves, okay, we've just been through something, like we're still in the midst of something huge. Who are we going to choose to be as a result of this, or even in the face of this? Like you said, at one point in time, I just didn't know who I was anymore. And so many of us are sitting there with like, who am I now that I've sat inside my house? Like me, since the 29th of January, 2020, and there's nobody else in here but me. But I'm a Gemini, so there is somebody else in here. I have another mind, another brain, voice in my mind. But who do we choose to become as a result? That depends very much on the narrative that we choose. And so this is a time to be awake and a time to be vigilant. So a friend of mine says, the most important real estate on the planet is this between your ears.
You have a wonderful quote that is, when you know your story, you can trust yourself. So that, to me, unpacking that, it means that not all of us know our stories, and that our stories have something to do with knowing who we are. Is that right?
Yeah, because, so people have bandied this phrase around a lot. Change your story, change the world. And that is true, because stories are our lens on the world. They're how we see and be in the world. They determine our identity and our agency, what we think we can do, what we think we're capable of. So it's an easy thing to say, just change your story. But our identity is so tied to our story that to just drop it is really hard, because there's so much attached to it. Like, who am I? There's only twice in my life when I woke up and I didn't know my own name or my own story. Both of those times were the middle of the night in Europe, like 3 or 4 in the morning, when somebody from New Zealand and Australia called me and didn't realize I wasn't in New Zealand, right? And they woke me up, and I knew exactly who they were. I knew exactly what we were talking about, but I realized in the conversation, and they never called me by my name, so I didn't know what my name was. And I realized, actually, I'm okay like this. If I need it, it will come back. And there was a liberation in not having any story in that moment. There was a freedom, because stories are their openings and their closures at the same time. They're productive and they're problematic. They're enclosures and they're encounters. All of those happen at the same time. So especially for us as women, and I think women are a powerful force, and we're going to be even more powerful as time comes and passes by, we need to claim the power of our story. Why being me is the most important thing, and what my special offering and my call is. Because there's a whole lot of people out there who don't know who they are, who are grasping on things and getting triggered by things. That's the other way you can know that your story is active, is when you suddenly are in a meeting or a conversation and you get a big emotional reaction. Then you know somebody's pinged on your storyline. You know that there's something to uncover, because there's potential. It might feel like pain at the time, but there's potential gold in there that you're unaware of unless you turn to face it.
One of the things that can be kind of hard when we're talking about stories is that the word story implies that it's made up. But when we're talking about our lives and we're talking about our world, it feels like that's the facts. It feels like we're telling the truth and we're not telling a story. So how does that reconcile?
First of all, it's interesting to notice that in the English language, and I think in almost every other one, there is no word for not story. So we, at this moment in time, have come to say, and New Zealand's better, that'll go, don't tell me stories, meaning don't tell me a lie. But that's actually the human system for making sense and meaning of the world. And so you could say everything is made up. If you really take it down to the fundamental level, because it's whatever you think it means. So something that happens is a space-time event. And the proof of this is in a meeting you go to where there are 10 people in the meeting and 10 different views of what happened. So somebody says something in the meeting, and one person goes, well, who does she think she is? And the other one goes, well, she finally stood up for herself. And the third one was, what? Wait, what happened? Each of these are us processing the space-time event through the lens of our own story. So when one person is saying, who does she think she is? Maybe that person is reacting to their own story about power, or what femininity is about, or what a woman should or shouldn't say in a business context, or what they have learned about how you display emotions and how safe that is or isn't. All of these are stories, because what's safe for one person is certainly not safe for another person. I was listening to somebody recently talking about, my job is to build trust in organizations. And I looked at that person, I thought, you are a young white male. And trust is a privileged conversation. So where you might think it's really easy to be vulnerable, it might not be safe for somebody else. And there are people even right now who are working on the different stories that men and women tell about power. Annette Simmons is one of those people.
Yeah.
So we narrate our lives differently.
Yeah.
So what's the fact and what isn't? I mean, courtroom cases have proven this. Memories shift over time. And I can think of a number of photos I've seen from my childhood where I wonder what really happened there, or is it just the story I'm carrying that somebody told me about this image? And when I talk to my sister, my youngest sister has a technicolor memory, and there are times I'll look at her and go, was I there? Because it's not something that's in my memory at all. It's somehow stood out to her, but not to me.
Yeah. So I want to go back to femininity. I really was interested when I talked to you earlier about the stories we tell about women, and especially the stories we tell about women approaching the middle to the end of their life, because it feels like as we approach menopause, as we pass menopause, the story is about us change in a really negative way. We're no longer attractive. We're no longer sexy. We're no longer relevant. So I want to know, as a master storyteller yourself, what do you think is a new story we could tell ourselves about women in midlife?
Well, I don't know how many people who are listening are over 50, but I noticed what happened for me when I crossed that boundary. There's something about watch out world, because now I am more concerned with what needs doing than what you think about it. So there's a freedom that comes with that somehow. And I think what we need, the simplest thing would be to look back to our indigenous people and look back to cultures who were closer to the earth, because they valued eldership. And in North America specifically, we have very often made our elders into elderlies. We've also broken the life cycle because we're removing grandparents and grandchildren. We put the older people in a residential facility, and we put our youngest people in kindergarten. But this was the circle of life. The youngers were meant to give energy to the olders who gave them wisdom. That's what's supposed to happen. And that gives the olders purpose and the youngers focus. So we essentially need each other. These days, for me, it's very clear we need to be intergenerational. Otherwise, as a humanity, we're not going to survive. Everybody's got to be part of it. It's not just, the younger generation should do something. So I think it's time for women to stand up and claim eldership, and to think a lot about stewardship. This is another word that I love playing with too. You can steward anything. And mostly people I've spoken to who are caretakers of places in the world, they'll say, it looks like I own this piece of land, but actually it called me. I had to own it because legally that's the structure I find myself in, but I know that I'm serving here. And that's what I intend to do because the call is so strong. So I look at this time, I think it was Barbara Marx Hubbard who called it not menopause, but regeneropause. So it's a time to, or refiring, not retiring, but refiring. So if you look at a culture like Japan, they want their elders to be elders and to be of service to the community and have their voices heard. So what are we asking of each other? Where is the invitation? This is the time for the art of invitation. And women are really especially good at the art of invitation and including other people, and at the art of noticing. So I can think of a person in Chicago. I know she is wonderful at calling people out around their strengths and their gifts. I've seen you. Would you do this? And sometimes people are like, no, not me. And she's like, no, I saw you. So she's inviting them to step in and step up. And I think all of us could be that. We could use our power of noticing. We could use our power of inclusion and connectivity. That's what women do. When we meet each other, we go, what about you? Oh, me too. That's what we like to do the most. That's my argument with the hero's journey, actually. And Campbell said he didn't collect the stories from women because those weren't available to him. Male anthropologists didn't have access to women's stories. So he had to go to fairy tales and folk tales to find them. And that's what he chose to look at for women. But of course, those stories that he would have looked at have been doctored by men who collected them. So the Grimm's fairy tales have been, and I've read a lot about the Grimm brothers. They laundered and changed and languaged differently to what they collected. The things that they collected were far racier, far sexier, and far more interesting. Probably also far more violent, which is interesting because young people need to know how the world works. So really, candy coating everything doesn't help them to know about life and death and how it works. That's the meaning. That's what tales were for, to help us know who we are and why we are and where we are and how we should be together. So I think it's time for us to find our voices, raise our voices, and claim back that power and say, wait a minute. It's about telling a story, not the horror story of how we've made the earth a slave, but the love story. How do we be in the love story? And I think women can call that forth wonderfully, and we should.
And you've got help for any woman who wants to start her storytelling journey and claim her own story. You've got a storytelling guide called 365 Alive. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Subtext is find your voice, claim your story, live your brilliant life. So I'm not as interested in exactly how do you tell the story as how do you find the story. So those of you who are out there going, I don't know, where's my story? I don't know. This is a 52-week guide that is based around a quote and a beautiful image that sparks a conversation that helps you to find your stories. So the first part is really about getting you curious about the journey. The second part is delving into your story field. What are the stories that you're made up of and how do you find them? And it asks you provocative things to do. So every section has a think about, which is a description of the theme. Take action, which asks you to do some things. And then the final part is have a look. So I've suggested movies and books and TED Talks and videos and other things that can really spark your interest to take you further. And then it's got a section on how stories work in the world. Stories are connectors. Stories are way showers. Stories are remind us of who we are. And then the final piece is what's your future story? And you can either run it as, okay, I'm going to start here and I'm going to go for a year and every week get invigorated, or you can dip in and say, okay, let me open the book. Oh, it's number 35. Wow, what's that about? And let yourself be inspired. So the more you actually work with your own stories, the more they're going to arise because you're priming the pump. The first one will lead to the next one. That's how the neural network works. Anybody who's been to a dinner party knows that. So if somebody's going to tell you their, what I call the bad travel karma story, but wait, it got worse. You wouldn't believe what happened next. There's always somebody at the table who go, wait a minute, I can top that, right? So that's exactly how it works for you in person. The moment you start working with your stories and prompts or being asked a question is the easiest way to do that. It's the easiest way to find something because your brain can then locate it. Most of the time we're flapping around because we don't know where to find something because we've never been asked anything that targets our attention. So the moment, and that's why a question in the hands of somebody who loves questions is a powerful, powerful thing. And a companion to stories. Stories and questions and conversations love each other. They're all related.
Now, for those of you watching, if you want to go get your copy of Mary Alice's book and learn about her storytelling community and everything else she does, we have a link for you. Just go to yourbrilliance.org/Mary Alice. That's yourbrilliance.org/Mary Alice. Thank you so much, Mary Alice, for coming onto the show. And I wondered if you had any last message you would like to leave our viewers with.
It's my favorite thing to say, really. That is, we live in a story, and that means we can change it. So just remember that it might be only one little word that would change your story. So what if you decided not to be against something, but for something? What if you decided not to be the best in the world, but the best for the world? That's a dramatic shift. Even one little word, and words create worlds, and there are stories inside of words. So you know what, everybody? The story is out there hiding in plain sight, and all you got to do is listen.
Thank you so much. And thank you out there for watching. Now, what was your biggest insight or aha moment while watching this interview? If you feel comfortable, share it with us in the comments. And for more interviews like these, make sure to subscribe to Your Brilliance TV here on YouTube. And then come on over to yourbrilliance.com for more tips and insights on how you can live your most brilliant life. See you next time.